The Emission Gap Report. Recently, United Nations Environment Programme UNEP has released a report titled The Emission Gap Report 2023 Broken Record, Temperatures Hit New Highs, Yet the World Fails to Cut Emissions, stating that urgent climate action is needed to avoid the alarming trend of temperature rise. This report, released by UNEP, finds that the world is heading for a temperature rise far above the Paris Agreement goals unless countries deliver more than they have promised. The report is the 14th edition in a series that brings together many of the world's top climate scientists to look at future trends in greenhouse gas emissions and provide potential solutions to the challenge of global warming. What is Emissions Gap Report, EGR? The Emissions Gap Report is UNEP's Spotlight Report launched annually in advance of the annual climate negotiations. The EGR tracks the gap between where global emissions are heading with current country commitments and where they ought to be to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Each edition explores ways to bridge the emissions gap. The report finds that there has been progress since the Paris Agreement was signed in 2015. Greenhouse gas emissions in 2030 were projected to increase by 16% at the time of the agreement's adoption, but today the projected increase is 3%. However, predicted 2030 greenhouse gas emissions still must fall by 28% for the Paris Agreement 2 degrees Celsius pathway and by 40% for the 1.5 degrees Celsius pathway. If there is full implementation of nationally determined contributions, the NDCs made under the Paris Agreement, then it might limit temperature rise to 2.9 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels this century. Fully implementing conditional NDCs would lower this to 2.5 degrees Celsius. The report calls for all nations to accelerate economy-wide low-carbon development transformations. Countries with greater capacity and responsibility for emissions will need to take more ambitious action and support developing nations as they pursue low emissions development growth. The report looks at how stronger implementation can bring down greenhouse gas emissions in 2035 to levels consistent with 2 degrees Celsius and 1.5 degrees Celsius pathways. It also looks at the potential and risks of carbon dioxide removal methods, such as nature-based solutions and direct air carbon capture and storage. About UNEP. The United Nations Environment Programme UNEP is the leading global authority on the environment. Its mission is to inspire, inform, and enable nations and people to improve their quality of life without compromising that of future generations. UNEP is driving transformational change by addressing the causes of climate change, nature and biodiversity loss and pollution. UNEP's work is focused on helping countries transition to low-carbon and resource-efficient economies, strengthening environmental governance and law, safeguarding ecosystems, and providing evidence-based data to inform policy decisions.